Good morning, everyone. I just want to take a chance to welcome everyone. My name is Terry Fleming. If you haven't met me before, I'm Director for Research Ethics BC. And I just want to welcome everyone to this final day of our 2021 Clinical Research Ethics Symposium. And I'm going to start off today by saying, for those of you who were not fortunate to join us yesterday when we had the opportunity to have Elders Grouse and Pamela Barnes join us, they let us know the importance of always acknowledging the traditional and unceded territories from which we join any meeting, even in the Zoom world. And so I am grateful today to be joining you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, namely the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I would just welcome everybody to please add into the chat if they want to also acknowledge where they are calling in from today. I'm going to go through a couple of general housekeeping things today, just before we get started. This event is being recorded and will be made available on our website at a future date. I hope everyone has taken the opportunity to review the bios of the panelists this morning. If you have not, Paula will be soon putting into the chat a link to our website where we have all of the bios listed, and so you can take a look at them while we're going through the event this morning. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that we are welcoming everyone to please use the chat function to connect and to speak with each other during the session. But if you have a question, we are using Slido to collect the questions and to help the moderator facilitate the questions. So if you have a question, please go to the link that is being added into the chat, and it'll be added several times during the meeting just as a reminder. And then you can add your question in through Slido. If you don't have access to Slido, please feel free to put your question and just say question, and we will pick it up, cut and paste it, and put it into Slido and help the moderator with the questions at the Q&A. So now I'm just going to turn this over to our moderator. Our moderator today is Caron Strahlendorf. Dr. Caron Strahlendorf is head of the Division of Pediatric Hematology and Oncology at BC Children's Hospital and clinical professor at UBC. And she's also presently the interim head of pediatrics. With a keen interest in ethics and cooperative clinical trials, Caron makes a perfect choice for a moderator for this session. So we're very grateful that Caron has been able to join us today. And now I will turn it over to you, Caron. Thank you.
Thank you all, and I too am very grateful to be here today and to talk about such important aspects around clinical research, and want to respectfully acknowledge that I am here at my place of work, which is on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And it is a great honor that we can be here today and respecting all our people and all our participants in research. So we have a great day ahead of us, talking about sort of changes and opportunities to look at clinical research differently, and the ethics around doing clinical research in a different paradigm. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves so that you can hear from them who they are. And then there's an opportunity for questions between each of the speakers. And then at the end, we will hopefully have some opportunity for conversation and some further questioning. So the first speaker today is Dr. Hubert Wong, who's the Associate Professor at the School of Population and Public Health at UBC. So welcome, Hubert.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. As Caron just mentioned, I'm Hubert Wong, and I'm Associate Professor at the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, though I actually spend most of my time in other places. So I also hold appointments with the BC Support Unit, the CHR Canadian HIV Trials Network, the Center for Health Evaluation and Outcome Sciences at St. Paul's Hospital. Are the slides up? I can't tell. Oh, great. Thank you. Great. So I'm a biostatistician by training, and so my talk is going to be sort of explaining why these issues about ethics and patient consent affect the integrity of a trial. So as a biostatistician, my main role in a trial is to ensure that the design of the study will yield unbiased and precise estimates of the treatment effect that we're trying to estimate. Okay. Next slide, please. Oh, and let me do land acknowledgement. I respectfully acknowledge that our co-learning is taking place on the traditional unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Next slide. Right, so what I'm going to do is just start off talking a little bit about traditional trials. Okay, so these are, historically what people have thought of when we talk about a clinical trial. And then I'll move into sort of specific circumstances that occur in what we're going to call non-traditional or innovative trials. And so I'm going to give concrete examples to illustrate how the ethical considerations in these innovative trials are slightly different than what we see in the traditional trials. I mean, pretty much everything that occurs in traditional trials are still relevant, but there's special circumstances with these innovative trials. And I just want to sort of raise these points and not give you answers. I don't have the answers. I think we're going to have a discussion about what they should be, particularly the other presenters are going to go into that in more detail. And so what I'm really thinking of is that I'm really just sort of setting the stage for the rest of the discussion in this session. Okay, the next slide. Right, so when we talk about a traditional trial, what we're talking about is a trial that's aimed to give a new intervention its sort of best chance at showing that it works. And how we do that is that we start off by putting fairly restrictive enrollment criteria. Okay, so we might say, okay, well, we'll exclude people with comorbidities, for example. And the whole idea is that we're trying to make sure that this new intervention actually does what we think it does in some subset of the population. Okay, and in order to ensure that we have unbiased comparisons and we have an efficient trial, the sort of typical design features we implement are individual randomization. So each individual gets randomized to one of the treatments. We aim for randomization after informed consent. Okay. The reason is that if the randomization occurs first and the participants know which intervention they're randomized to, then they may choose to participate or decline based on knowledge of what their randomization is. And that can impact who gets into the trial. In particular, it could be differential between your treatments. Another feature of traditional trials is constant randomization probabilities, usually 1-to-1. So every patient who consents gets a 50% chance of being allocated to one or the other intervention. And finally, another typical feature of the traditional trial is that we follow patients very closely in, after they receive their intervention in order to collect the outcome data. Okay. Now that's done not only to get the outcome data, but also because we're trying to give the intervention its best chance at working. We try to, I'll say accommodate and support these patients as they go through the trial. Okay. And so a lot of this stuff is not what happens in the real world. So there have been issues or questions about, well, to what extent do the results from traditional trials apply when these interventions are implemented in the real world? Okay. And so when we do implement them, of course, we're going to have different issues. And so we're going to have to think about what issues we have to worry about additionally in these non-traditional trials that we're going to talk about. Okay. Next slide. Right. So there's been a lot of talk out there about adaptive trials. And so an adaptive trial is one where the design is actually changed based on the interim data that you've observed. And so there's various things that one can do. For example, one might decide partway through the trial that the intervention isn't working in a particular subgroup of your population. And you may choose to say, okay, well, let's give up on this subpopulation, but we'll continue running a trial in the rest of the population. Another one might be that you decide that, oh, well, there's some new promising intervention that's just been developed, and we want to add that intervention as a new arm to the trial, right? And the third one, which is the one that I'm actually going to talk about, is what we call response adaptive randomization. And so in this one, what we do is that as data accumulate in the trial, we change the probabilities of randomizing people to different interventions. And in particular, we start randomizing more patients to the arms that seem to be working well. And there's quite a bit of literature out there about, is RAR, or response adaptive randomization, ethical? And the reason why there's this concern is that if you look at it from sort of the participant welfare point of view, one could argue that it would be unethical not to give a higher chance to receive what appears to be the better treatment. Now, you'll note that in the slide, I have better in quotes. Okay. But somebody else will come along and say, yeah, but if you believe that one treatment is better than the other, then isn't it unethical to randomize anyone to the one that appears to be worse? Now, there's been quite a bit written about this, but I sort of feel that this might actually just be a sort of a red herring. I think what really matters is, when can we be confident that a treatment that appears to be working better actually is better? Because the whole point of the trial is we don't know what's better. And until we're sure that, or we're confident that one is better, well, we're still in ethical place. It's still reasonable to allocate people to treatments randomly. The question is, what's the cutoff? At what point are we confident enough? Okay, and I think that's where the ethical issue comes in. And, now I don't have the answer to this. And I'm not even quite sure how we should even explain this to patients when we're consenting them, because what they feel is sufficient evidence might be different from what we feel is sufficient evidence. Okay. Now, other people have come along and said, oh, okay, well, yes, there is that issue here, but maybe we can make an argument for RAR based not just on participant welfare, but also based on a trial efficiency point of view. Okay. Now, one of the arguments for RAR was that typically what this leads to is that fewer patients in your study receive the worst treatment. Okay. Now, the problem is that if you think about this sort of heuristically, that may not actually be a good idea, because what that means is that you're going to have unequal numbers of patients in your two arms, in the two-arm trial. Okay? Now, the most efficient trial is one in which the numbers are equal. So now you're saying that, well, I'm actually going to make my trial longer by doing this. And so while that trial is ongoing, well, there's all sorts of people who are not part of your trial who might actually be receiving the inferior treatment. Right? So by making your trial longer, you're delaying the answer to the question. And so maybe overall, you're actually not minimizing the number who are receiving the worst treatment, because people outside the trial are receiving the inferior treatment. Okay. So I don't think that there's a single answer to this issue here, but it is something that needs to be considered in these adaptive trials. Next slide. Okay. Now, another type of trial that people are using these days is what's called a cluster randomized trial. And in the cluster randomized trial, we don't allocate individuals to the treatments. We allocate groups of individuals to treatment. So for example, we might say that, okay, well, hospital A, you are going to deliver the new intervention. That means that everyone who presents at hospital A is going to receive that new intervention. Okay. And in this situation, this randomization is occurring before you're even screening the individuals. So when you go to screen them, you can't actually ask them, do you want to be randomized? Too late. You get what you get. Okay. Now, this poses a problem because, as I said earlier, when the individuals know which intervention they're receiving, that may affect whether or not they'll want to participate. And depending on how different these interventions are, the people who are willing to consent in each arm may not be representative of the population. So for example, if the intervention was something which required a lot of effort on the part of the participant, participants who are severely ill may choose not to be part of the trial because they don't feel that they can undertake the effort involved in being part of this trial. Okay? So this leads to potential differential selection bias. And that leads to the question of, okay, well, if this is potentially is going to occur, how should we consent patients in such a way that we mitigate this happening? Okay, and so one of our other presenters will talk about this in more detail later on. Next slide. Okay, so another type of trial which is becoming much more prevalent now are what we call pragmatic trials. And in a pragmatic trial, the aim is to evaluate how well the intervention works in the real world. So in this case, who we're really interested in is everyone who's eligible, not just people who are willing to consent. Okay, and if we're interested in this question, then what we really want is outcome data for everyone, not just for people with consent. Now, in sort of the traditional trial, this was not really an issue because if people weren't willing to consent and you could only get outcome data by following them up, well, that data just doesn't exist. And so there's no point even talking about that question. But in many of these pragmatic trials that are being done now, the outcome data can actually be obtained from health system records, either clinical or admin databases. And if that's the case, then the question arises, well, under what conditions would it be appropriate to extract these data from the health system records? And what sort of consent do we need to do that? Okay. And again, I don't have the answers, but again, one of our later speakers will go into this in more detail. Okay. So I'll just conclude by saying that, next slide. Oh, sorry, I forgot to elaborate on this, this last aspect about health system data. I did want to point out something very specific about health system data, and that is that consent on this issue sort of goes outside of the trial itself. If we start off with our entire group of eligible patients on whom we want outcome data, there will be a subgroup who consents to participate and a group who decline participation. And I believe that current guidelines, well, there's a current lack of guidelines about when is it acceptable to get data on these people who actually decline participation. Okay. And in those who participate, some complete follow-up, which is good, some withdraw, and if the study asks these people how they want their data to be handled after they withdraw, there will be some subgroup of individuals who say, yeah, it's okay for you to use my data anyways, even though I'm not part of the study anymore. But there might be another subgroup who withdraw their data. They say, you can't use our data. Okay. And that sounds very clear-cut, suggesting that, well, we can't use their data. But I'm not so sure that that's necessarily how we should, what we should accept. Okay. Again, there's a bit of a discontinuity here, or a bit of an irony here, in that if you ask people whether you can use their data or not in the context of this trial, and they say no, then you would think that, well, we can't use their data. And yet, on the flip side, if this were not a trial, then we had proposed a study to get to use their data as secondary analyses, then with the appropriate application, usually that would be approved. And so it's kind of strange because it's almost like you're encouraging the researchers to not ask for access to data in a trial, because the patient might say no, and that's really not what we want to do, right? So again, let me just say that I don't have the answers to this. I'm waiting for the other speakers to raise the discussion on this. Okay, so next slide. Right, so on to the others. Thank you.
So Hubert, thank you so much for starting off our sort of discussions today and bringing our minds and thinking about the complexities of these trials. So I don't have any questions at the moment, but I thank you for raising the questions. I know that the answers are hard, but again, I hope people are thinking through these and thinking through some of the ethics around approaching clinical research in a different way. So thank you, and that was a great talk. And now I'd like to ask our next speakers, who are Jennifer Cordeiro, who's the Senior Research Coordinator at the Digital Emergency Medicine Group at the Faculty of Medicine at UBC. And I think you're just speaking by yourself, right?
Helen starting.
Will join you as well. And the other speaker is Dr. Helen Novak Lauscher, who is a PhD in the Emergency Medicine Department at UBC as well. So welcome, both of you. If you can introduce yourselves, please.
Thank you. I'm just going to try to share the screen here for the slides. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thanks so much for inviting us to share our experiences. So many of the issues that Hubert described fit with our experiences. And I'm joining from the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I am Associate Lead of Digital Emergency Medicine in the Department of Emergency Medicine at UBC. And I'm a social sciences qualitative researcher by training. So my colleague Jen and I worked together on this, our first clinical trial, clinical RCT, the Tech for Home Health Monitoring Trial, of which Hubert was a co-investigator as well. So I'll share a bit about the Tech for Home trial and the decision ultimately to go with a stepped wedge design. And I'll then pass it over to Jen to share 3 ethics-related issues from our experience. Tech for Home studied how home health monitoring can support the transition of care for heart failure patients from hospital to home. Our hypothesis was that Tech for Home would decrease 90-day emergency revisit rates and hospital admissions for heart failure patients. We also hypothesized that Tech for Home would improve patient health outcomes and experience, improve communication between healthcare providers and patients, and be a cost-effective solution. So the project was funded by the CIHR eHealth Innovation Partnership Program that funded studies using eHealth technology to support care for seniors in a real-world setting. So EHIP emphasized the development of healthcare innovation communities with diverse partners working together to co-develop and study eHealth solutions. Tech for Home had 2 phases. Phase 1 was a pre-post feasibility study to test out and refine the implementation and evaluation processes. We recruited from 3 hospital sites over 9 months, with all participants receiving the home health monitoring intervention. Phase 2 was an RCT to collect clear and comparative evidence. So phase 2 was a scale up to 21 hospital referral sites across 4 health authorities, with a mix of urban sites, regional hospitals, and smaller rural communities. We recruited over 15 months. Intervention received usual care plus 60 days of monitoring after they left the hospital. Control received usual care. And while phase 1 was extremely useful in testing things out, you can imagine that it couldn't prepare us for every challenge we'd face with the added scope and complexity of 21 sites across the province. So for phase 2, we changed course from what was going to be a cluster RCT to a stepped wedge design, in which sites are randomized as to when they switch from control to intervention at 3-month steps. So sites, not patients, are randomized, and each cluster of sites recruits into the control and then intervention condition on a step schedule, which is shown in that diagram there. This helped us address the challenge of matching sites in the first place. So with a limited number of hospitals in the province, we needed to work with those who were interested and also able to participate, and finding a match on characteristics such as population, bed size was daunting, if not impossible. Another advantage to the step wedge design was that by the end of the study, all sites were enrolling into the intervention condition and offering home health monitoring to their patients. So that was a practical approach for health authorities to go from a study to operationalization. So this pivot to a then relatively new design presented some unique challenges that I will pass over to Jen to discuss.
Great, thanks, Helen. So I think one of the first real practical issues that we had to grapple with was the harmonized ethics review process and reconciling some of the feedback that we received through the various review boards. And a great example of this was the consent form and how we described our study designs, the step wedge, and how we randomized the participants into the control or intervention groups. So in our first version of the consent form, we started with the standard. This is a controlled clinical trial. This is using a stepwise design. A controlled clinical trial means this, and a stepwise design describes that. And of course, the feedback from the review was the information about the step wedge design may be difficult to simplify. It's sufficient to say that the participants will be randomly assigned. So we made that modification, which was approved. But then in a subsequent review, we received some further feedback that stated, because this is a stepped wedge design and patients are not randomly assigned, this can be confusing and potentially misleading, since it implies there is the chance they could receive the monitoring intervention when really there is no chance, which was true. So again, we really had to think about how to best describe in the simplest terms what we had designed and why, and how this could impact the patient's decision to participate. So ultimately, we landed upon a really brief description about how the sites were randomized at the beginning of the study period, and then how the participants' assignment into the study group would be determined by where their hospital site was in the overall randomization schedule. So we went with, at the beginning of the study period, the hospital site you were visiting was randomly assigned as to when to enroll participants into the control or monitoring intervention groups, and the group that you are assigned to is determined by where your hospital site is in the overall schedule. And so this is the description that we use throughout the rest of the study. Also related to the harmonized review and amendment process. So at the outset of the study, we had developed, of course, one protocol, one set of research materials to use across the sites. However, it quickly became apparent we needed to change or adapt some of our procedures to the different policies or preferences across the different health authorities and sites. And this became even more obvious as we started to learn more about the workflows of the clinical teams on the sites and the different research resourcing differences at each of the sites as well. So we made adjustments throughout, which resulted in multiple versions of similar but different procedures and various versions of the same but modified documentation, which was ultimately feasible, but at times, of course, a lot to manage across 21 sites. Next slide. Great, thanks, Helen. So the second insight that we wanted to share related to our experience implementing the stepped wedge trial was this ongoing discussion that we had about concealing the participants' group assignment during the informed consent process. So this is somewhat related to the previous point about how we described the randomization process. But we also wanted to highlight the perspective of the recruitment team members who were responsible for approaching and enrolling the participants. So early on, we received questions and feedbacks from some of the recruiters who felt uncomfortable withholding the information from the participant until after the consent was obtained. So in our study, the recruiters knew and needed to know what sites were enrolling into the control group and then what sites were enrolling into the monitoring intervention group prior to approaching any prospective participant. And so in some cases, when either directly asked by the participant or told by the participant that they only wanted to participate if they were in X group, and it really went both ways. Some patients only wanted the control group, where others really wanted the monitoring intervention. The recruiters found it really difficult not to be able to disclose what group they were currently recruiting into, especially when it conflicted with what the patient wanted. So to help manage this, first on the consent form, we included a line that stated that the group that the patient would be assigned to would be revealed after they consented into the study as a way of protecting the integrity of the research data. And then second, we also hosted coaching sessions with our recruiters to help them become more comfortable explaining this aspect of the study design and why it was important to the ultimate outcomes of the research. And I think over time with the practice, it became a little bit easier, but still definitely a consideration when doing a stepped wedge trial like this. Next slide, please. Great, okay. And then as a final insight we wanted to raise for discussion today was something that we experienced at a few of our recruitment sites, which was working alongside other research teams, also recruiting and approaching patients for other studies at the same time. So, you know, I think in the spirit of being fully informed, we need to consider how we ensure prospective participants have been provided with all of the options or research opportunities available to them in a way that's fair to the research teams, to the patients, but not too overwhelming. In our experience, what we tried to do is harmonize our approach, collaboratively working with the other research teams, which I think worked. But I think there were some also very real or practical challenges to this as well. So like resourcing constraints and coverage on site or time sensitivities in the consent process that can create conflicts. And as patients hopefully become more interested in participating in research, it'll be really interesting to continue navigating this in future studies. Next slide. So just to wrap it up, for the Tech for Home Heart Failure study, the step wedge trial design answered some of our initial implementation and change management challenges, but then introduced other considerations throughout the study. Most of these emerging issues as we confronted them were quite manageable, and we were able to adapt, but I think we also learned that some of these considerations may be bigger than any one project and would benefit from further experience and conversation like today. Next slide. So we thank you for your time and appreciate your interest, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you for sharing your study, and I think importantly sharing your insights, because I think many of us can sort of think about those insights, and certainly as an REB member, what does that mean for us? I'm sure there are questions, so I'm going to give a little bit of time for people to ask you questions about your study and about some of your thoughts and insights, either in Slido or in the chat. You've stunned us. I suspect as we go through everybody's talks, we might come up with some unifying themes that will come through. So I thank you again for presenting your study to us. And I'd like to now say thank you to you and hand over to Alicia Murdoch, who's a project manager for CanSolve CKD Clinic. Welcome, and maybe you can, Alicia, introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Caron. So I'm just going to share my screen here, make sure I have it up properly. So yeah, my name is Alicia Murdoch, and I am a project manager at CanSolve CKD, which is a CIHR strategy for patient-oriented research network that is doing that supports kidney research. Also, we are all across Canada, so we're a Canadian-wide network. So there are two infrastructures within CanSolve that I manage, and one is the Canadian Nephrology Trials Network, which is a network that's working to improve the relevant number and quality of nephrology trials studies in Canada, as well as to increase research capacity. And I also manage the Pediatric Committee, which is a group of pediatric researchers representing all of the Canadian children's hospitals in Canada who are developing and promoting pediatric kidney research. So research primarily, I think as most of us know, primarily occurs in the metropolitan centers like Vancouver, even though only 50% of our population lives in the Lower Mainland. I did a cursory search on clinicaltrials.gov of chronic kidney disease studies in BC, and there's only 14, and they are all in Vancouver except for one, which is in Vancouver and in Kelowna, which one could argue is a fairly large center. So we know that patients are traveling several hours to get to the Lower Mainland for their specialized care, and research generally involves maybe bi-monthly or monthly visits for research purposes, and those are just not feasible for these people. And I think they're even not feasible for people living in the Lower Mainland who have other responsibilities such as family and jobs and school. So I think decentralized clinical trials could be a great alternative to offer up trial participation to more people. And I think that also, given our last 18 months of doing things more virtually, I think that people are feeling more comfortable that they could potentially want to do this in the future. So I'm going to speak today in very broad terms, obviously, because we don't have a lot of time, and every study is very different. There are some aspects that can be of decentralized clinical trials that can be very quickly adapted into new studies, but others that would require a higher level of planning, and which often means a larger budget. But for the purposes of my presentation today, I'm just going to be discussing two general models that we have been discussing within the Canadian Nephrology Trials Network. So the first is a primary and satellite site model, which the Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials Network has recently published on. So I referenced it here at the bottom. So this model would have your traditional research site with the PIs and research coordinators, other research specialists like allied health and pharmacists, but they would also have the administrative support for finance, ethics, and regulatory aspects of the trial. And then you would have your satellite satellite sites, which would have, these could be community clinics or hospitals that don't generally do research, and they would have a clinician, they might have nurses, but they wouldn't have specialized research staff like a research coordinator. So these studies, these satellite sites would be delegated tasks based on their training and capacity at the time. So they may just be involved in recruitment or consenting or physical exams or other things within the study that are part of clinical care. But I think this could be a great way to build capacity in these satellite sites, which is something that CNTN is trying to support. It wouldn't be feasible to ask one of these satellite sites to hire a research assistant for 1 or maybe even 2 studies. But a clinical team may be interested in research and testing the research waters, and I think this would be a great way to do that with the support of the primary site. So the second model would be one in which the participants only visit during their usual clinical care, or maybe even never, depending on the type of trial that it is. Excuse me. Follow-up visits often just require a review of their AEs or con meds, as potentially questionnaires to be done. All of this we know can be done via video conferencing. Questionnaires can even be done via RedCap if there's if you want to make sure that if they want some privacy in terms of the answers of the questionnaires. So there are lots of other studies that I've heard of that are more decentralized, that could have, such as doing local blood work at local labs, having x-rays and things like that done at their local clinics, even going as far as having the devices or medications delivered to the participants' houses. But obviously that just increases the scope of your project. For both of these models, I think that it's important to utilize and grow the connections within the community hospitals and clinics to encourage clinicians to in turn encourage their patients to participate in research. And this may require some additional education on the part of the researchers to the community clinicians about the trial and about how it could benefit them and their patients. Very briefly, I just want to talk about remote informed consent. So I think remote informed consent is a little different than e-consent, which uses like validated hosts like RedCap to capture the consent. These have some great advantages, one being the version controls. I think having worked as a research coordinator, knowing when new consent forms get approved and having to make sure everybody signs the right versions. But there's also that auditability that e-consent offers that are really great. In some of my past positions, what we have done is for those patients for whom we have consent to contact, we would mail them a copy of the consent form to review ahead of the clinic visit, and then approach them at their visit, so that we could potentially do a screening visit while they're already there if they have reviewed it, and then we could do the rest of the consent process there and be able to enroll them right then. With remote consent, you could send these people the document, including those who responded to a recruitment ad, if you were doing that, and then set up a video conference if they're interested. And during the video conference, the coordinator would have the same conversation they would have with the participant were they in the clinic, reviewing the consent document, going over inclusion, exclusion, and risks and procedures and everything, answering their questions. And then if the person signed, they could mail back the consent form if you needed a wet signature, mail it back in a pre-addressed, pre-stamped envelope, which is something we had done in some of the clinics I worked in. Then if so now the Health Canada has a clinical trials modernization consultation paper that came out, and they mentioned proposing changing the language regarding requirements for consent from written informed consent to documented informed consent. And this could mean that you could use an electronic signature, a video or audio recording of the consent process with the participant verbally agreeing to be a participant. And so capturing this consent process, obviously in a video or audio file, would lead to another set of SOPs, because you need to make sure that you're storing these these files properly in terms of privacy, and obviously we're going to still be needing to store them for 25 years. But then also something that struck me yesterday was Dr. Murthy was talking about his study where they were using infographics to explain the consent. And I think we could all agree that the process, the informed consent process, is the part that matters. And like, does the patient know what they're signing up for? And I think with remote consent, informed consent, you could be better able to replicate the process that usually takes place in the clinical setting. Just a few of my conclusions in terms of pros and cons to decentralized clinical trials. I think the top three are kind of linked in my mind because investigators are able to cast a wider recruitment net, being able to reach those people outside of the Lower Mainland to get them to participate. There's less burden on the people who do choose to participate because they're not having to come into the physical site as often, or maybe even never. And then, which could only lead to better, to being able to reach your recruitment goals, which those of us who do work in research know is always an issue, in a timely manner especially. My fourth pro for this is that more clinicians are offered the opportunity to participate in research, as I'm a firm believer that we should be increasing the capacity for research within our own province and across Canada as well. There's always cons, and so I think that some of these, there is a segment of the population, and I think we touched on this yesterday as well, that does not have easy access to the devices or reliable internet that would be required to participate remotely. So I think we always have to remember that even as we're doing our best to try to include more people, there's always more that we could do to reach out as much as we can. There could be instances in where you can offer devices for people to connect, or I don't know, maybe be offered internet. We'll see what the future holds. There may be costs for setting up some of these virtual platforms, potentially shipping, mailing things if you are going to be doing, a device like Fitbits and things like that, mailing things, as well as it can be time intensive because this is a new thing. So you are going to have to set up SOPs about how things are going to be done and how things are going to be tracked and kept accountable. Discussions with REBs back and forth about how to do it. And as well as I think building those relationships with the community clinicians and helping to set up the satellite sites. And I think all these things, obviously your time is money. And so all of these things need to be considered. But I do believe that some trials can be set up with minimal additional costs and that this initial investment could lead to significant dividends in the future of research in BC. So, So with that, I'd just like to say thank you again for letting me come and speak. I put CanSolve and CNTN websites, and we're on Twitter, so please connect with us if you'd like to.
Alicia, thank you very much for your presentation. And absolutely, we need to be inclusive and have as many participants as we can across the province and across Canada included in clinical research. There's no question. Thank you all of you for putting questions in the chat. We'll get to some of them, and I suspect some of them will be answered with our next speakers. But I just want to see if there's anything specifically for you, Alicia. Not at the moment, so I suspect we'll come back to you at the end, but thank you very much for sharing your insights. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Anita Ho, who is a bioethicist, an associate professor at UBC, and hopefully is going to answer all our questions. So welcome, Anita.
Thank you so much. Can people see my screen? Great. No, as an ethics person, I actually generally frustrate people even more because I ask even more questions. And hopefully that I keep thinking the more questions I ask, people would think that the answer would be much more obvious, but it doesn't always sound like that. But it's really a pleasure to be here. I've served on the UBC BREP, the Behavioral Board, for many years, and I still substitute for people who can't make it sometimes. But I also have been working at UCSF, and I ran the Responsible Conduct for Research course for the last couple of years. And so it's really great to be hearing different experience in terms of different trial designs and what are some of the concerns that we have here. I also would like to acknowledge that we are co-learning here on the unceded territories of the Musqueam people, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I am currently actually calling from the ancestral land of the Coast Miwok, Pomo, and Wapo people in Northern California. One thing that I want to point out, and this artwork by Christy Belcourt, who is a Canadian Métis artist, one of the phrases in here that I really take to heart, and I'm going to be actually talking more broadly about research ethics and consent issues that have been brought up here today as well. If I may just read this short quote here. The plants are teachers. They're connected to each other and all other spiritual beings through the sacredness of life. When I remember who I am, a human being connected to all of life, I remember also that I'm loved by the spirit world and our ancestors. And when I remember this, I remember to respect even the smallest of things. And so one of the ways I want to think about with us here today is to also think about when we talk about cluster trials, pragmatic trials, and step-by-step designs and so on and so forth, how do we also help ourselves to recenter in thinking about why are we doing research in the first place? How are we actually respecting everybody and the society that we're in, the land that we're on when we're doing this co-learning and co-investigating together? I also want to acknowledge Dr. Sudi Julie, Dr. Kip Kramer, and Pia Gans, who have been working with me on a project on promoting ethical design and data integrity for cluster trials. We are focusing on issues about consent there as well, and we are still actively recruiting researchers, REB members, and patient partners and representatives for interviews and focus groups. So please feel free to reach out if you're interested in this. Part of what we're really trying to see is how do patients, how do the public think about consent issues, particularly with some of these more pragmatic trials. And I think that especially when we think about right now in the pandemic, that probably some of the research designs that Hubert talked about earlier as well, the quote unquote traditional designs, actually don't work as well. And so sometimes we really have to have a much more adaptive way of thinking. But I think that probably if we can recall and recenter ourselves in thinking about the research ethics principles, then we'll realize that when we think about consent, of course, is very important. That is actually a very small part of what we are doing. Even the Tri-Council policy statements talk about how we have to think about respect for persons, concerns for the welfare, and justice. And I think that actually we have to really think about them going together. It's not one outweighing the other, but they all have to connect with each other. And the TCPS talks about how these principles are complementary and interdependent. So we can't just talk about consent without also thinking about justice issues. How they apply and the weight accorded to each will depend on the nature and the context of the research being undertaken. So how do we think about the traditional RCTs versus step-by-step designs and other designs? They're all really very much context dependent. So when we are reviewing RAB applications, we also have to keep that in mind. Challenges of pragmatic and cluster trials that Dr. Wong also talked about earlier. Where do we actually get consent? At what level are we asking for consent? Are we going to have some concerns about recruitment or data bias if we are asking people for consent when they might already know or want to know which arm they might be in? Sometimes there may be questions in terms of even asking, what are they exactly consenting to? And I think some of the presenters already talked about how you don't actually have a choice to be in one arm or the other, but maybe that the site that you're part of, the hospital you're part of, will be already participating in a particular research. So exactly what are you consenting to? Are you simply consenting to whether your data will be included or not? Especially when we realize that in some of these cases, we're not asking any individual person who would be part of the sites to be doing anything differently. So I think that that actually is a very relevant issue in keeping in mind, because sometimes that when we are talking about consent, that people need to know what they're getting themselves into, what they are consenting to. There are questions in terms of whether actually that is relevant in terms of what people will be doing or what kind of care they are getting. And there are also questions in relation to how I think Dr. Wong mentioned earlier too, that, perhaps when we talk about something being a trial, then the access to data is quite different from if it is not being considered as a research trial. Again, if people are not actually doing anything differently, is that distinction that we're making actually relevant or really meaningful to even people that we are trying to consent? So if we're refocusing back onto the TCPS principles on respect, welfare, and justice, then we may want to think more broadly about how do we have realistic and transparent considerations of individual risk while also recognizing our connectedness. We're doing projects together, we're asking for research, asking for learning together, and the individual consent model may or may not be able to really help us to answer all of those questions. So one framework that hasn't been brought up today yet that I think is actually really helpful and perhaps important and necessary for us as we move forward in thinking about research. This article actually came out in 2013, so already 8 years ago, about learning healthcare system. And that's actually something I feel very passionately about, in the sense that when we think about informed consent and when we think about ethical research design, I'm concerned that sometimes we may be trying to draw the line between what is research, what is clinical care, a little bit too clearly, too distinctly, when they actually, very often, there really isn't that much of a distinction. And sometimes there may be questions in terms of whether we are drawing the distinction for the purpose of consent procedures. And I think that actually we may need to think from the other way around. So according to Faden et al.'s article on learning healthcare system, a learning system is really one that actually thinks about everything that we're doing, even in the hospital, in the clinic setting, in the care setting, in a care delivery setting, that we are still trying to learn. We're still trying to collect data from what we're doing to try to do better. So in that sense, how we actually think about what is research and what is clinical care is not that different. But we can still have overarching ways of thinking about ethics in terms of how we actually carry ourselves, carry the work that we're doing. How do we respect the rights and the dignity of all the patients that we are serving? And how do we also respect clinicians' judgment in determining what would be appropriate types of interventions to be implementing, to be trying? But when we talk about the trying, it's not just that, oh, now this is research. It's really that we are always trying to think about how to do things better. So we're really trying to see how do we promote the optimal clinical care for each person who comes through the door, each person that we are serving. And for whatever we're doing, whether it is in clinical care or you call it research, when we're studying the clinical care, we're also trying to avoid imposing non-clinical risks and burdens on patients. And when we think about it from a much more bigger system perspective, we also think about how do we address health inequities, inequalities, or as Alicia was just talking about, also the unequal access to better care, better opportunities for research as well. So when we think about research and care together in the health, learning health system, then we're really trying to think about how do we conduct continuous learning activities that can really improve the quality of clinical care and healthcare system together. So what that means is that we are all trying to contribute to the common purpose, the interconnected purpose of improving the quality and the value of clinical care and healthcare system for all that we serve. One of the interesting things from this article that I was talking about, or the whole general notion of a learning health system, is just to ask really questions in terms of whether individual level consent is an absolute requirement. In this one part that they talk about the obligations and responsibilities of a learning healthcare system, One of them was an obligation for patients, for any general public layperson, to think about an obligation that we have to contribute to the common purpose of improving the quality and the value of clinical care and health systems. And you see on the right side how participating in these learning activities that are consonant with other obligations in this framework will, of course, require us to respect the rights and the interests of patients. But there may be times when foregoing express informed consent could be justifiable. And this is partly because of the impact of the framework's other obligations, that we cannot actually move forward with particular learning activity and quality improvement without expressed informed consent. But what does that really mean? So even the TCPS does allow us to think about alterations to consent requirements. And in some situations, that may even be allowance for no consent or even no debriefing. So this is really going back to the balancing act. How do we think about whether this project is above minimal risk or not? So if a project is not any more than minimal risk and is unlikely to adversely affect the welfare of the participants, and it is impossible or impractical to carry out the research and to address the research question properly if we require prior consent, then there may be justification for the researchers to be submitting information to the REB to explain what the precise nature or the extent of any proposed alteration to consent requirements. There may be times when you would do a debriefing afterwards, or there may be times to also say people can be allowed to withdraw the consent. However, as Dr. Wong was talking about too, in some of these cases, if people are allowed to withdraw consent, let's say withdraw consent to the data being part of the data set, then you may be concerned about the integrity or the completeness of the data sources. So then that may be the question or the time to also ask whether we can use a more proportionate approach that can consider what may be the foreseeable risks to the participants, what are the potential benefits to participants and broader society, and what may be the ethical implications of the research. So I think to conclude, what I want to say is that I think informed consent in many ways, in many quote unquote traditional trials are important when it is feasible, but it is really an imperfect tool. Sometimes it promises more than what it really delivers. And I think other times we actually, even if informed consent is there, we still really need a much bigger picture of thinking about governance. Why are we conducting certain types of research in the first place? And then how do we actually promote prospective participants' well-being and respect their rights? So it may be more about having oversight of information that's being provided to participants or prospective participants. Somebody mentioned infographics earlier. Can there be notices around different facilities about what maybe different types of, whether you call it quality improvement, learning health system projects, and so on and so forth, around so that people can know what may be some of these co-learning activities that may be happening. Participants probably want to also know more about dissemination and application of the results to various populations, and whether actually it is the case that different populations will be affected in unequal kinds of ways. So I think that especially during this COVID pandemic, that we can learn a lot from various ways of thinking about public health surveillance, public health projects, and so on and so forth. How do we test different types of potential treatments or mitigation strategies and so on? So I think that, again, not to say that we should never have consent. Of course, that would be not a sound advice, but though I don't think that we should only focus on consent. We may sometimes have to even go beyond thinking about informed consent and to really think about what ethical research would be. How do we attend to the bigger picture about justice and fairness to make sure that we are attending to vulnerable and historically disadvantaged populations? I think if that is our starting point, we can design trials in ways that would be respecting people more than rather than thinking simply about consent procedures. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita, for grounding us, for reminding us of why we are here, why we are clinicians and why we are researchers, and the importance of respect and just remembering our humanity. So thank you for doing that. I know there are some questions which I think we'll tie up at the end. And I think now I'd like to hand over to, in my opinion, the strongest voice, and that is the voice of our patients and our partners. So Linda, welcome. Linda Riches is a patient partner and was involved in the Tech for Home project. So Linda, welcome.
Thank you. I would like to start by acknowledging the land on which I live, work, and play as the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lheidli First Nations. I also want to preface my comments by thanking all of the people who presented today, as I have gained knowledge and I have things that as a patient and a patient partner I will be reflecting on later on, and even the document that was mentioned by Anita, I look forward to being able to read that and digest some of that information. So I don't have slides. I'm just going to read something that I prepared for you today. And I'll just start. There are two ways that patients can be involved in research: as test participants and as patient partners. While their roles are different when it comes to ethics and informed consent, there is no difference. A successful research project for all participants requires confidentiality, respect, and trust. Patients require transparency in the purpose of the research, how it will be conducted and by whom, how it will be used to improve medical care, potential risks and benefits, how long they will be needed and what will be asked of them, and what will happen to their specific data that has been collected during the project. In terms of data consent, a growing concern for patients is who has access to their information that is amassing in various forms of technology. Many patients believe that their health data belongs to them, and they must be consulted before that is shared with anyone beyond their primary care team or specialists who may be involved in their care. But anonymous data collection does not appear to be an issue for many patients. A strong research project respects and taps into the intelligence and lived experience of patients who can and should be involved from the beginning. They can look at a project through a specific lens and offer suggestions to the research team on how to avoid potential issues with test participants. They can suggest appropriate language and terminology to avoid obfuscation. They can create the paperwork They can help create the paperwork for informed consent and other documents, such as a terms of reference. Consent and terms of reference need to be ongoing processes. Neither of these documents need to be onerous for the patient to read through and understand. While I can't speak for all patients, my experience is that patients just want the information I mentioned before, and they want it in plain language. Multiple pages become a burden for patients to wade through. If the project needs to change direction due to new findings, it may not be necessary to revise those documents, but the research team needs to review the changes with the patient partners. The above points are all informed by my positive experiences with Tech for Home. This was actually the first research project I was involved with as a patient partner. The team, particularly Dr. Ho, treated the patient partners as partners in research. They wanted to understand the obstacles that heart failure patients face. We were involved in planning, document creation, and problem solving. Each time we met, there was consultation on the project. Often we were treated as a checkpoint to see if something fit into the world of the patient. Once the research was underway, we were able to participate in meetings to discuss preliminary findings. This continued for the duration of the project. Much of my learning about positive patient-oriented research in Tech for Home has carried over into other patient partner engagements, but it has shown up clearly in my involvement with a current research project titled PGX for Depression, towards clinical implementation of pharmacogenomics to improve the treatment of people with depression in BC. Very few people join research projects thinking of how it will benefit them. Most patients join research projects because they feel they have something to contribute. They want to learn more about a particular area, and they know that their involvement may help patients who might benefit from the research. That's it. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing us your experience and the importance of having that patient voice, which is just so crucial to the work that we're doing. So thank you, and thank you for being here today. At this point, I'd like to thank our panelists for just giving us some thought, some amazing sort of things to reflect on, some reminders of why, some reminders of our humanity. And so I'm going to start and open the questions to the panel, and we have quite a few questions. So I'm going to mention who they're addressed to, and then if you could please take these questions, that would be great. So the first one is to Jennifer, and that is to asking if you could elaborate on how patient partners were engaged in your trial and value they brought to the study design and the conduct.
Mm-hmm. I think Linda just answered that question for me, which I really appreciate. That was really heartwarming to hear. But just to elaborate a little bit more, so we did include 3 patient partners right up front during the grant development process. So we're really fortunate to be connected to them, have them contributing to the grant, and wrote letters of support, and really valuable in understanding the intervention that we were planning, the home health monitoring, you know, what that would look like for them, how that could best work practically, and what they were hoping to achieve from what that type of technology could help patients like them achieve, and what outcomes would be important for them to understand. Once the project was funded and we were getting set up, we also included patient representatives on each of our project committees. So our guiding steering committee and our operational evaluation committees and other planning committees as well. And then also created a patient advisory committee, which was made up of all patients and included more than the 3 that we had originally engaged. And that committee was very, very valuable in providing feedback on materials like the recruitment materials we're using at the different sites, or we had done an infographic of our results from our first phase and had the committee review that and provide feedback and edits and stuff. So again, super valuable to have that input throughout the development process. And then some of the committee members, the patient committee members, participated in the coaching sessions with the recruiters, or at various times were able to provide feedback on our approach and help us understand why some prospective participants might decline to participate, you know, how to overcome or how to help speak to any of the fears or questions or concerns that people might have about participating in research. So yeah, very valuable to get that feedback kind of in real time and with a very specific question or issue at the end of that. So, and then we've also done a feedback session, like a focus group session with the patient partners to really understand their motivation for wanting to be engaged and how we can increase their enjoyment of that engagement and what they were looking for to be a part of the committee as well. So a very great learning opportunity, certainly benefited our team and our project. And it again, was really great to hear Linda explain her experience as well.
Thank you. And maybe to Dr. Wong and to Dr. Ho, are there components of pragmatic trials that exclude them from being conducted with a waiver of consent?
Well, I think maybe one thing we should make clear is that there isn't a real hard guideline or dividing line between pragmatic and traditional trials. It exists sort of on a continuum. So to what extent is a trial more pragmatic versus less pragmatic? And so it's not that the issues that arise in traditional trials don't arise in pragmatic trials. So, for example, we may think of a trial as being pragmatic because we're looking at a less restricted population. But if we're talking about an intervention, which is, let's say, still not approved, then, of course, we still have this issue of ensuring that patients understand that the interventions that are being tested are unproven. And so in that case, you probably wouldn't want to have any sort of waiver of consent. So that would just be one example. There'd be others, but that's the one that comes to my mind.
And I would think that another example may be whether it is actually feasible to get consent. And so depending on whether your pragmatic trial may be also partly an observational study. So in some cases, it's a lot less feasible to actually get consent. And so, and if it is minimal risk and it is not feasible, then you may have a much better case or justification for waiving consent in those situations.
Thank you. So I know Jennifer and Helen brought up the discomfort in their research assistants. And the question is really about that this has been seen by other researchers, where there's been discomfort about concealing interventions at the time of consenting. Yes, I think we do need to discuss this more, but Jennifer and Helen, do you have any words of wisdom around how you manage this?
Well, I think as we talked about the consent form as well, it was a bit of an evolving process, really trying out the wording to be as accurate and truthful as possible while still maintaining that integrity. And I think it is partly, talking that through with the ethics boards and then with the recruiters. And again, really understanding what the concerns or fears are of both the recruiters and the participants. So I think, again, I think with the experience of going through it a few times, the coaching sessions did help. But it is an interesting balance, like how much information should you provide that's not too overwhelming or complex, and what do participants need to know that could impact their decision to participate, essentially.
Linda, do you want to give us your thoughts on this?
Not at the moment. Sorry, I'm reflecting on what she just said. So.
Okay. Thank you. Sort of in your step-wedge design, how did you decide which sites were allocated to employ the experimental treatment first and which ones last, and how did you make that decision? Helen?
Oh, that was, thanks. That was the randomization process. So that was where the randomization came in with the schedule of sites. And Hubert advised and consulted with us on this and his team. So with the that scheduling, then there were some practical considerations around, which sites were ready and those kinds of things. But that was the randomization aspect of it.
Thank you. Alicia, here's a question that's directed at you, which is that could partnerships with local physicians increase engagement with participants with technological barriers? And has this already been done?
I think for sure. I think that anytime, I think engagement with those outside your research sphere, like I know everybody's talked about how we do know everybody. We're in a small province, but we know that we're not including some people in the conversations. And so I think that engagement is really important. It's hard right now. I have been reaching out to people at community clinics, but they're all doing 1,000 other things related to COVID and patient care that it's kind of hard right now to get them involved. But that's definitely something I think for the future. I think patients, like as a person who sees a physician, your relationship is, and especially if you have a chronic disease such as our kidney patients, you have that relationship with your physician. And I think that it goes a long way in terms of like your decisions to participate in other things. And if we can build relationships with those clinicians in the community, I feel that they will be the ones to be able to turn people onto research and say, yeah, I think this would be a great opportunity for you. And I don't know if it could remove the barriers of technology, but I think it could be a good step towards it.
So I think you've sort of raised an issue, and that is around satellite sites being enormously stressed at the moment, under-resourced. So my question really is that in these smaller satellite sites, should there actually be more focus on hiring local research coordinates that are funded by the study and cited in these satellite spaces?
Yeah. And I know that I'm lucky enough to work in the national group, so I do know what goes on in some of the other provinces, and I know that they do this in Ontario, specifically with one of the groups that I'm connected with, where they have hired someone and they have permission to go into these other clinics and to recruit people from there. And so I think that could be a huge thing. As we know, like, we're trying to say economy of scale. It's hard to go to someone and say, hey, there's a study we'd love you to participate in, because it's just not worth it. It's going to be a losing proposition for these people, and they're spending a lot of time and effort to, potentially only get 1 or 2 people. So I think it's an economy of scale where if we could we're trying to see if we could get a bundle of studies that people could participate in and offer them as a group, saying, here are 5 trials that are ready to go that we would love you to join in on. Are you interested? That could offer them the ability to hire someone, or alternatively, like you said, having the primary site have a person who is specifically an off-site recruiter who goes to these other sites and does the heavy research lifting for them.
Perfect. Thank you. Jennifer and Helen, in your study, did the coaching and the prep work that you did for your recruiters, was that over and above what you would normally do for your studies?
Well, I'll start, and then Jen was really the closest person to this, who coordinated and, put all the pieces together. But yes, it was very different. It was like listening to Alicia's talk, really, that, we were doing a decentralized trial. So we worked with all of the different sites to understand what their capacity was at the site. So some have very developed research teams, and then we would, potentially second individuals. We trained and engaged a group of student volunteers that were able to either be at sites or were at the remote sites, as well as sort of deployed research staff where we could. So it was a very diverse group, and it reflects sort of, what Anita and Linda were both saying about that orientation in being part of this big research initiative. It's really taking that orientation of being a learner, and that, the recruiters were all learning, we were learning. So really, I guess, capturing the diversity and being able to meet the different recruiters where they were in terms of what type of support they needed.
Perfect.
And yeah, I'll just add it really did create like a community of practice. There was a lot of really great sharing of experiences, and I mean, each site was quite different from the other. So bringing back some of like the different challenges and using the example of, you know, explaining the consent and stuff, I think is a great one of how they were able to coach each other. We were able to learn alongside with them while increasing like research capacity essentially across the whole study. It was, yeah, I think a very positive experience. And yes, a lot of work and much more than we do usually, because we do work in a research team and use our researchers usually.
So maybe Linda, this is something that we'd like your help with, and that is that, you know, our concept forms are long and very many pages. And if they're long enough right now that we're adding the additional complex and innovative trial designs, is this asking too much of participants when we add this into the consent forms?
Short answer is yes. I think they are necessarily long at the moment, and that is a barrier. People just like, why? I understand there's reasons why all that information is included. But I feel like when I read those, I feel like I'm reading like one of those long insurance policies where you have to read every single line, you know, before you sign. And particularly for people who English is not a first language, it is also a barrier. So that actually was something we discussed in the Tech for Home project. We talked about things like people who were participating where English wasn't their first language and how that affected them. So I think there needs to be a way to reduce the current length of the documents, because I actually probably would not sign on to a project as a patient at the current length of the document. It's like, these are the things I need to know. And if you satisfy those things I need to know, I'll sign. And yeah, so in my other life, I'm a teacher, and it's like giving students a very long thing to read and then expecting them to be able to say back to you what they read. You know, it's like there's no way to remember all that data. And I know it's kind of like CYA for people in research, because you want to make sure you've covered all the legal things that might get in the way. But yeah, back to my short answer is yes.
Thank you. And I think you, Anita, you have a comment, but I want to just thank Linda, because I think you've spoken to an issue that we all face, and certainly sitting on the REB, it's something that concerns us. So Anita.
Thanks so much for that, Linda. And Linda, your comment reminded me of a participant in another study that I was part of. Somebody said that your consent form is not informing me, it's actually confusing me. And so if you're really trying to help me to understand better, this is not it. And so, and I, you know, from a justice perspective too, I do wonder whether there are times when some of these consent materials actually may violate the justice principle, because some participants may actually be made to feel like they're inadequate because they don't understand all the things that we're putting in. And I mean, if you think about how often as REB members, some of us here who are REB members, that we have trouble even understanding all the documents, and how would we expect participants to be able to understand it? And so I really appreciate the Tech for Home having other ways of thinking about the governance and framing the research, rather than putting so much of the emphasis on the consent forms and materials.
So Anita, while I have you, I'm going to ask you what the role and the ethical responsibility is of the REB to to ask the researchers to change the ICFs, the informed consent forms, so that it is more accessible to participants.
Actually, Dr. Shannon wrote a comment in the chat box. I don't know whether she would like to say more about it, because I think that maybe RAB members can also help to see how do you structure your informed consent form materials to help to facilitate that process. I don't know, Laura, would you like to say something to that?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an issue. If as a member of the REB, I can't even make sense of it myself, then you're right. Most people will just not have a clue and be intimidated and not know what they're rejecting, let alone consenting to. So I'm wondering if we need kind of the core, here's basically what I'm doing, here's what we're asking of you, quick summary of risks and potential benefits. This is what you will do and this is what we'll do with your information. And that's pretty much it. And then what if we had attachments that here's the full list of known risks and possibilities for a drug study, or here's background information. I asked a question later in the chat about if it's an innovative design, how plausible are the results to come from it if it's not yet a validated design method? Do we need to disclose that? Do we need to explain this new innovative design? Well, that doesn't have to be in the heart of a 30-page consent document. It could be an attachment. And so, if I happen to be really interested in the fact of an innovative design, I could go read about that or skip it. And I think, we've kind of got into this, there's a model of an informed consent document. What if the document itself were a little bit more easy to shape to different circumstances, different participant groups? You may need 5 attachments for a complex high-risk study, or it might just be a simple 2-pager for a rather simple survey study, right? Yeah, but I agree. I think, and engaging patient partners,
Absolutely.
We are expert-driven. And the jargon is insane and the assumptions are not applicable. And we need real people speaking regular language to be involved at all levels of this process. And I think that one of the things that gets me is kind of the arrogance of the expert-driven research, that regular people matter and their perspectives matter, and whether it's working for them matters enormously. And we fail to engage that sufficiently. So yeah, I think there are a lot of things we could do with consent forms that would be, that get us away from consenting the patient to engaging people to decide whether they want to participate or not. It's that shift that we need to do. Anyway, those are just my thoughts there.
Well, thank you for sharing those. Those are important, and I absolutely take your point of being sort of so expert-driven. And certainly in the pediatric world, I know many of our study participants read the assent because that's where they can actually understand and get the information that they wish. Anita, comparing treatments might not be minimal risk, but there could be clinical equipoise. Do you think this would be addressed in the points in the TCPS to 3.7?
So they are not minimal risk,
but there's clinical equipoise.
So the TCPS is really, I don't think the TCPS is really focusing on the equipoise issue in relation to that. The proportionate part is really more about whether the trial that you are running is minimal risk. Now, unless you say that and I'm open to other people's comments here, because I'm thinking out loud here, unless you're saying that actually the minimal risk here, in terms of your everyday risk, because of equipoise, is that basically it's the same risk that you would be one way or the other. So I would be open to what others might think about that. Is that question in relation to whether we need consent or whether we would ask for further support for deviating from consent?
Anybody? Yeah, I mean, I think that again, it's all you could have clinical equipoise, but have significant risk within that study. So I think it's really proportionate, and it really does depend on what you're looking at and what your study question is. So I don't know that it's always could fall under minimal risk, but I think it's something to consider.
Well, yeah, and I think Dr. Wong may have a much better answer in terms of the equipoise, because, I mean, in many ways, if you're starting a trial, you're supposed to be in equipoise, whether it's minimal risk or not. Right? You don't supposedly know which one is better, but I don't know if Dr. Wong wants to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the starting point of every trial, right? I mean, if you don't have equipoise, you probably shouldn't be doing the trial. So I don't know that I have much to add to it.
So there was a question here around whether the long, burdensome boilerplate ICFs are a result of REBs moving their responsibility to weigh the risks and benefits of the research to the patient. And I know there's been lots of action in the chat where it's, I think we're hearing it, is that there's a time now for us to really look at how we do our ICFs. And again, it's not just the form, it's the process, it's that engagement with our participants that we need to continue to remember. That's important. So going beyond informed consent, are biobanks, secondary use of data, consent forms, and data repositories going in the right direction? And maybe I'll ask Dr. Wong that question.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not really the best person to address this. I mean, I don't really deal much with this type of stuff in trials.
Anita, your comment?
Can you ask the question again, please?
So the question is really whether going beyond informed consent, whether biobanks, secondary use of data, and data repositories are going in the right direction.
That's an interesting question. I'm wondering whether the person who's asking this is thinking about just only in the context of biobank and repository, or whether thinking about maybe even broadening that for other types of trial. So very often with biobanks, we don't know what the specimen, what the samples would be used for. And sometimes some of the agreements that people are signing or the consent materials is almost like an open consent. I think that biobanking has, in one way, I'm not sure whether this is about the consent, it's really more, the governance piece seems to have been much more front and center. Maybe partly because we don't really know where the specimens are going to be used for quite yet. And so in some ways, I think that it may actually allow us to think more about how do we actually build a governance model, whether have patient partners and much more public engagement. And I think Dr. Shannon mentioned about public engagement in really thinking about the purpose and the scope of work that we are trying to do, rather than only focusing on an individual type of consent form. Because I think in the biobanking situation is that you don't really know for sure where else your sample may be going. But that's why we want to have a much broader way of thinking about building trust and making sure that we are all responsible and responsive in terms of how we're actually using materials. I'll be curious about others' thoughts on that as well.
No comments, but I'm going to go on to sort of question sort of the audience, and that is that, you know, what is the REB's role regarding innovative designs to ensure the methodological rigor when there's new, you know, sort of new changes to new paradigms around how we the methodology behind trials. So, meta-analysis. So what is the role of the REB in these, in evaluating these methodologies?
So I don't have an answer to that, but can I share a very brief experience that I'm going through right now? So I mentioned in my presentation that I'm working on this cluster child ethics project. I'm still hoping some of you would be interested in participating. And one of the things I've been working on with the BC Support Unit staff members, Research BC, it's on putting together a video to explain cluster trials. And I think somebody mentioned earlier that if we have like innovative trial designs, how do we explain it? And so I kept being stuck on this, like, can I do an 8-minute video that we can post on our ORS website, like Office of Research Studies websites, that can be used to explain what cluster trials are? And our lovely colleagues keep pushing back to say, no, 1 to 2 minutes, 1 to 2 minutes. And so I think it really helped me to shift my thinking as well, in terms of like, I think I need to explain things in 8 minutes, but who, so Linda mentioned she's also a teacher in her other life. One of the things I've heard a lot in medical education is not what we're teaching, is what is being learned. And so I'm curious, right? And so that I might be stuck in the researcher way of thinking that this is what I think I need to give out there. But that may not be what the participants or partners would be getting out of it. So, so could REB think about how, in terms of informed consent, should we start thinking about how do we have resources so that researchers can have, short videos or something like that to explain their trial design? And if we are not able to explain the trial design in 2 minutes, myself included, probably it's on us that we need to really think about how to do that in really building respectful engagement and recruitment practices.
Thank you. And I think there was a question that I think you had already addressed, Jennifer and Helen, and that was the use of infographics as part of your explanation of your study design. So I don't know if you want to comment on other ways that we can be as researchers, as patient partners, be a little bit more engaged in helping REBs, in helping our patients, in helping our researchers.
I think someone had a comment in the chat about drafting an informed consent form and then sharing it with patient partners and getting them to review and provide their input, like what is relevant to them and what's not. I think one of the things is, though, every patient participant's a different situation, context, and will have different questions. And so what might be relevant for one person might not be relevant for another, and vice versa. So I guess it's finding that balance. I like the idea of maybe an executive one-pager that highlights all those key points that can answer at least at a very high level the major sections of a consent form, and then the backup documentation as needed to provide a deeper dive for those who are really interested in knowing exactly who's handling their data and where is it being saved and how long it'll be saved for. Because I think it is all interesting and important information to know, and you might not know what questions or what information you, as a prospective participant, you are interested in knowing until you start participating and start thinking, okay, wait a minute, I'm disclosing all this information. Who actually is going to see it? Whereas when you start, you just want to participate, you're excited about the opportunity, or there may be, something else that attracted you to the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw that Linda had posted that short engaging videos with a focus on learning is what would be helpful. So again, I think lots of thoughts for us who wear researcher hats, and also lots of thoughts for us to support and guide our researchers. I am going to see if there are any last minute questions from the audience. A lot of these are sort of in Slido are sort of comments, And then I'm going to end with one big question that will leave us all thinking for the weekend. So are there any other questions or any comments that people would like to make? So my final question, and that's to all the panelists, is there an ideal ethical trial design? Because that really summarizes what our day's been. Dr. Wong.
My answer? No. I mean, I think the whole issue here is that, I mean, different people have different values. I mean, we have different risk tolerances. We have different things that are important to us. And so any sort of trial is always a bit of a balancing act, right? You know, there are certain things which you sacrifice in order to ensure that your design is maintains its integrity. And it's really a question of how much sacrifice are you willing to make. I don't think that one can put a label to it and say, well, this is how things should be done. You have to essentially find out from the people who are going to be involved, you know, well, what is your sense of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, or what's your sense of what's ideal, right? And you tailor it to that. It's not a cut and dry. I mean, I'm a statistician. I'd love for it to be cut and dry, but it's just not.
Anita.
So I would think that probably the ideal design would depend on what your research question is to start with, right? So very often people think about a quote unquote gold standard, the randomized control trials. That is not the ideal design, depending on what your research question might be. But I think that perhaps even this panel is really helping us to think it's not so much the ideal design, it's the ideal preparation. The ideal preparation would be engaging those who would be most affected, the community, patient partners, and especially those who might be most marginalized and historically disadvantaged. And so when we have that as the backbone, then we would be, as Dr. Wong was saying, then I think that we would have a much better chance in figuring out what would be the ideal design to address this particular research question we have.
Absolutely. And I think that Dr. Shanna posted maybe not best or ideal, and there are several bad options, but possibly multiple good or good enough options. And I think that, you know, that is what we should be striving for. And I think we're almost at the end of our time. And I just wanted to, again, just applaud our panelists for helping us and guiding us in thinking outside the box. That I think we have to think about new approaches to asking the questions, to moving our healthcare forward, to be inclusive, and to make sure that we hear people's voices and that we include as many of our as many people as we can into our research studies. There is no ideal design. There is no ideal way of doing this. But I think if we can go back and remember what Anita started her talk with, and that is there are reasons ethically that we have to ground ourselves in. And if we can just remember those principles, I think we will have the ideal ethical trial. And so I wish you a happy weekend, all of you. I hope this conversation does continue. And that was one of the questions on Slido, is how do we continue this conversation? I think as our research groups and as our REBs, we need to continue these conversations because they're really, really important. And I think it's really important that we continue to hear patient voices and to have patient partners as we do, as we change and we engage in an alternate way of thinking about things. So again, thank you all. Happy weekend, and till we next meet and have these conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you very much, Caron, for wonderful facilitation. And to all of our speakers, I'm so grateful. And I just want to mention to everybody again, these groups that we formed for the seminar, for the sessions over the last 2 days, they helped like really pull this together themselves. And so I'm really grateful to everybody's energy and enthusiasm over the last couple of months while we narrowed down what we were going to talk about in these sessions and what was best for education purposes. So thank you very much for everything you've done. And that wraps up basically our 2021 Clinical Research Ethics Symposium. And I would also take this time to personally thank the members of our organizing committee. Anita David joined us as a very vital patient partner. Talisa Dahan of BC Children and Women's, Alana Dick and Jessica Gagliardi and Nama Rosen of BC Cancers REB, Pia Gans of UBC CREB, Dorothy Herbert of Interior Health, Karen Medler of Island Health, Alison Orth of Clinical Trials BC, and of course our team that's been fiddling everything in the background very quickly, Aoife Kelly, Paula Pinto-Vidal, and Hannah Jones-Erickson. I'm very grateful for everyone's support of this wonderful event. We will be sending out an email to everyone following the event to give you an opportunity for feedback, and please include ideas in there for topics for future events. I am sure that informed consent will never go away as a topic for our events, and so hopefully we can do some more work. I know this one in particular has come up with some wonderful ideas for how we can start off a great working group to proceed with redoing our ICF template for clinical research. And if you require a certificate of attendance for professional development credits, you'll be able to access that through the feedback survey when you get the link from the email. And that's it for final comments from me. Thank you to everyone, and I hope you all have a very good weekend. We look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.